So primary challenges. At the end of this section, I'm going to invite Mr. Sutaria to comment, and then we can ask if there are any questions. So let's just start with this then. So hazard identification. Multiple companies who have not identified their hazards. So what do we actually mean by hazards? Well, the first thing is, do we understand what a hazard is? And when we talk about a hazard, there's a special word that we associate with a hazard, and it's potential. So a hazard has potential in some way to cause harm or upset to the business. Doesn't mean it will. It can in some way harm people. It could harm the finances of the business. It could harm the equipment. It could harm the aircraft, etc., etc. So this is a hazard. So do we know what the hazards are within our organization? And the common way of assembling the hazards is by using the risk register process. So we can talk about that a little bit. So it's challenging to correlate different hazards with associated risks related to multi-operational safety scenarios. And it's a manpower intensive activity. So we've got to look at how we're going to work with this. Have we allocated enough resources and are we getting a return on our investment? What do I mean by that? Well, it's not safety at any cost. So what we've got to do is identify the issues which have the biggest potential to cause harm and to concentrate initially on them, and then step by step to fill out or backfill and so that we grow our risks. And just to give you an idea, many 145 risk registers that I have seen typically will have somewhere in the region of 80 to 120 risks identified within a 145. If you're a 145 and an operator, that number would go from 150 to 250 typical risks that have been analysed. So just to give you a feel for the size of the task. Okay, not uncommon for AMOs to have insufficient data to fully identify the degree of exposure. So another of the challenges, how do we start gathering data? And we can integrate data from multiple sources. And in fact, the quality assurance department, the last 2 years of audits that they've carried out is data that can be used to populate the safety management system. There is a huge amount of information because basically every finding from an internal audit is an opportunity to develop a safety system understanding about the exposure and about whether it's a systemic issue or it's an isolated issue, whether it's related to process, procedures, documentation, training, or other aspects of the business process. Often conclusions are not shared and communication channels are not working adequately. Means within the organization, we're not communicating. We're not communicating from the organization to the camo or from the organization to the operator. And these are all challenging areas. And whenever we look at an incident or an accident or an event and start to understand what happened, why it happened, how did it happen, the takeaway is that nobody wanted it to happen. It wasn't intended. It's an unintended consequence of something, and then we start understanding what that something is, and many times that something is related to miscommunication. Risk management, a lack of understanding is often evident related to the main risk. We just talked about this before when I was mentioning about the risk register. So without understanding the risks, it's very difficult to put in place mitigation strategies. And a mitigation strategy, essentially, as I'm sure you know, is anything that we do which lowers the risk level. It doesn't make it go away necessarily, but it can improve our exposure. So, as we said, developing risk registers is an important step. And then safety performance. So we have had now a decade of safety management system exposure within an operations environment. So collectively, industry is starting to understand ever more about the safety management system. And one of the aspects now that is taking more prominence is the safety performance. And so we will have to develop methods and measures to show that we are managing our safety performance, and we can show that it's acceptable for our organization. Now, there's a grace period. What do I mean by that? Well, from December last year, we've now started for real implementing SMS within our 145s. But the regulatory authorities have been told by EASA, go easy on industry for the first 2 years. See that they have got safety management systems in various phases of development and implementation, but don't over expect that they will have safety performance indicators, aspects fully operational. So this period of grace, which is for the next 2 years, will be allowing the 145s to build their data set, and that's a good thing. So we talk also about management of change. What do we mean? Well, essentially anything that we do within an organization has safety system implications. If we grow too fast, for example, we get skill dilution. If we lose key workers, we get competence gaps, and so on and so on. So with the management of change process, what we should do is make sure that we assess the risk for a given or particular change that we introduce in the business, and that we take the necessary steps. And the thing about this too is this isn't a black and white story. It means the steps that you take are the appropriate steps for your organization based on your organization objectives. And the takeaway from this is it makes it incredibly difficult for regulatory authorities to audit SMS. And understand this, because when I have conversations and they say, oh, well, the regulatory authority hasn't got any problems, or they've not had issues. I said, what you've got to consider is this, that when the regulatory authority audit you, they're asking the basic question set. Do you have an SMS? Do you have an SMS manual? Do you have procedures? Have you been training? And so on and so on. All of this is almost tick the box questions. What they don't do is ask performance questions. What do I mean by performance questions? Okay. In this particular business area of your 145, what level of reporting did you achieve in the last 12 months? Okay, we had 20 reports. Fine. Is that what you expected? What is that ratio of reports versus employees? Are there any other indicators, for example, from the quality assurance auditing, that would indicate that there is other things that have not been reported into the SMS, but they exist? And these are the questions where you're then asking the organization, is your safety management system working the way you want it to do? And then the next question becomes, so what actually do you expect it to do? And how are you measuring what it is doing? These are performance questions. The regulatory authorities, if I was to say they're not very good, that wouldn't be fair. The correct way to say it is, guys, they're hopeless. They really are hopeless. And I know this from 10 years of safety management system hands-on experience with operators. So the thing about it is, unfortunately, everybody can create a safety management system. Everybody can spend money on the safety management system, but it's only when it's really functioning that it adds value to the business, because it can. It can save the business multiple times what it costs. And I don't just believe that, I could demonstrate that to you over again. So I'm an absolute believer in the value of safety management systems, not just because of safety. For me, that's a given, but because of the way it can influence effective management within the business process. Okay, so change management considerations. One of the questions was, what is the relationship between the organization and the competent authority related to what we need to report to the authority? So here we're talking about the safety management process, and we've got the reference here. The revised MOE should be submitted to the regulatory authority, and there is a procedure. There's a link here that you can visit this. We've got a number of blogs, and this one is about safety performance indicators, safety performance targets, so you can have a read about that. There's also, if you visit the Surfamer Aviation Service library, I'll show you how to do that later. There is actually, in the safety management system area, we have more than 200 blogs about this. So a huge amount of information related to safety management systems, and you can dip in. There isn't a cost. You can dip in and to access this stuff whenever you want. Okay, so this is actually one of my favorite graphics. If you understand the term iceberg of ignorance, you know where I'm going with this. If it's new to you, then this is what is being understood. And one of the main players in this story, going back a quarter of a century actually, was Boeing. Boeing, who you may be aware of, is the developer of MEDA, Maintenance Error Decision Aid, although now they've rebranded it as Maintenance Event Decision Aid. So what we understand is this, that frontline staff see 100% of their problems. And I had a guy pop up and he says, whoa, 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 hang on, how can you say 100%? I said, you're misunderstanding. I said, you know 100% of the problems you know. If you don't know about it, it's not your problem. Ah, yes, okay. He says, I see what you mean. I said, it's not that you know all the problems, you just know all of your problems. Now then, your supervisor essentially is only aware of 3/4 of your problems. Why? Because you're not communicating everything with your supervisor. It's normal human communication interaction. And then when you go to the next level of management, have a look, 10% now. So the frontline staff is experiencing issues. The general manager is understanding 1 in 10 of their problems. See where I'm going with this? And then when you get to the leadership team, we're down in 1 in 25 problems. So when I meet, as I do often, frontline staff, and they say, the management hasn't got a clue what's going on. I said, you're absolutely correct. It's 100% correct. They understand 1 in 25 of your issues. Why? The reason is because they're not psychic. They're not magicians. It's not a magic story. You expecting somebody to know your problems is not realistic. And this is part of the communication. This is part of the education of the workforce. Because it's only going to change when we get engagement. What do I mean by engagement? Well, what I say to people, frontline staff, I said, you should be thinking about supporting your system at least once a month. So at the end of the month, what's the biggest issue that you've had? Can you identify something that is, in your opinion, an issue that is ongoing, systemic, rather than just a one-off? Okay, feed it into your system. And if people start doing that, we start getting the data that we need. Data integrity is managed by safety reports, safety information, safety sources, safety data. I've got to go through this quite quickly. Why? Because time is of essence. We do multiple training courses. I think we've got 70 different safety courses. So we go through this slowly, step by step, but either you can do it online or we can do it as a web course experience for your guys. But the next thing to look at, SMS data, we've got to manage the data. This is a GDPR story. So we've got to consider how that is going to happen. We've got to have process and procedures for that. We've got to look at what data can be shared. How it's a positive, of course it is. There is a reluctance. Organizations don't like sharing their data with other organizations, but if we sanitize that data, then we can share. But how do we do it? This is something to think about. And we've spoke about ineffective safety reporting. It is actually one of the big issues that we've got. Manpower process shortfalls in the management of the reporting processes. Who is managing the reporting processes? We'll talk about roles and responsibilities in a little while. A general lack of an integrated approach between the role of safety, quality, security, the various business processes. How do we integrate with the concept of safety? This is the challenge. Also the challenge of external interfaces. It carries on. The balance between the cost of SMS and the SMS and the return that we're getting, the return on our investment. And it's a perception, of course. So we need to get the numbers right so that we are not letting the data slip away from us, but we're not, let's say, wastefully processing the data. We're doing it in an effective way. Then we've got to make sure that people have been trained. Who can do the training? Well, in actual fact, the training that people need is job role specific training. And this is another of the mistakes that so many companies make. They believe that one size fits all training is great. It isn't. It's actually, in some cases, even more costly than you need. But consider this. The mechanic in the hangar actually needs different safety training than the certifying staff, or the hangar manager, or the nominated post holder, or the accountable manager, or the quality and safety professionals. Who's going to do the investigation? There is training for optimizing the investigative process. Who's going to do that? What about root cause? All the business areas managers need to be able to understand what is happening with root cause. And there is a huge amount of misunderstanding related to this area as well. And a lot of it is related to ineffective regulatory authorities. Why? Because they will give you a finding, you'll submit the finding, and they'll come back to you and said, you've not identified the root cause. Well, that's ridiculous. Why? Because for any given situation, we don't have the root cause. We potentially have multiple root causes, and we have multiple contributing causes related to each one of the root causes. So one issue, for example, could have 3 root causes and a total of 12 contributing causes. The regulatory authorities don't engage with that at all. And as a result, organizations have not got better, but an effective SMS will pay attention to root causes and contributing factors. And in reality, each contributing factor is an aspect of the business process that is not working exactly as you would like it. So therefore, we've got to make a change. See where I'm gone with this? So the regulatory authority hasn't helped at all. And in some ways, it's almost like tick the box on their part, that they have to demonstrate to EASA that they are auditing industry. So as long as they've got all the paperwork filled in, as long as they can show they're asking for root cause, they're the good guys. But they're doing it for themselves, not for the benefit of industry. And that's a shame. Support material for continuing airworthiness. Historically, we've got endless material supporting operational SMS. Whenever you go to IATA or ICAO or any set of information, it's endlessly talking about unstabilized approaches, it's talking about runway excursions, all the flight stuff, but you never hear them talking about maintenance related exposures. So when I go to these meetings, and I go to many such meetings, and a person is explaining all about this, and I put my hand up and I say, okay, fantastic. I said, can you give me 3 examples, please, in a maintenance environment which would equate to a similar level of exposure? Guess what? Stony silence. They can't. So the takeaway from this is, it's not that they don't exist, they absolutely do exist, but we've got to understand and develop it ourselves. Means within our organizations, we've got to develop this, because there isn't a on the SOFAMA website, there are many lists which will give a big help to you, but there isn't a magic end to this story. It's very early days, and it's something that will continue to develop in the next 10 years. That's support material. The next one is top-down leadership. What does that mean? So to be super effective, SMS should be cascaded down from the leadership team, who lead by example. And this is so important in organizations. And sometimes you see organizations where there is an expectation that the safety management system belongs to the safety manager, and he or she is responsible to deliver that safety management system. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work, and we'll touch on that a little bit more.